Mr. Happy Goes to the Beach by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Happy was going to the beach for a vacation with his friends. He had to take a train to get there. On the train he met Mr. Grumpy. Mr. Grumpy was feeling bad-tempered as usual.
"It will probably rain all week,"
he grumbled.
"And the hotel will probably be awful, and the beds will be hard, and—"
Mr. Happy was not listening. He could see the sun shining, and in the distance he could see the sea. Mr. Happy was sharing a room in the hotel with Mr. Muddle. When he arrived, Mr. Muddle was trying to unpack his suitcase. Mr. Happy looked around the room and laughed and laughed. Mr. Muddle had hung up his shoes in the closet. His pyjamas were in the bathroom, and his alarm clock was in a drawer. And where do you think he had put his toothbrush? It was under his bed. The next morning the sun was shining again. Mr. Happy picked up his bucket and shovel and ran all the way to the beach. Mr. Small was sitting on a newspaper. He was afraid of getting lost in the sand. Mr. Lazy was lying under a striped umbrella. Mr. Impossible was digging a hole. "I'm tunnelling to the other side of the world," said Mr. Impossible. "Impossible," said Mr. Happy. "Nothing is impossible," said Mr. Impossible. Mr. Tall had built a huge sandcastle. Mr. Happy made a flag from a lollipop stick and a piece of paper. They had 3 buckets of water ready to fill the moat. Mr. Bump came to help them. He bumped into the first bucket and it fell over. The first bucket knocked the second bucket over, and the second bucket knocked the third bucket over. None of the water went into the moat. It went all over Mr. Happy's feet. "Now that my feet are wet," said Mr. Happy, "I may as well go for a swim." The water was very cold. Mr. Happy saw Mr. Nonsense and swam over to him. Mr. Nonsense could not swim very well because he was still wearing his hat and gloves. Mr. Happy looked at him and laughed. Just then a big wave knocked Mr. Nonsense's hat off and carried it away. A seagull picked the hat up in its beak and dropped it on the beach. Mr. Happy laughed even louder. After his swim, Mr. Happy found Mr. Silly fishing in a pool. Mr. Bounce was watching Mr. Silly. He was sitting on a rock that was covered with seaweed. He thought he would be safe there. But seaweed is very slippery. Mr. Bounce slid off the rock and bounced right into Mr. Silly's fishing net. "I've caught a whale!" shouted Mr. Silly. Mr. Bounce bounced out of the net and right up to the top of the cliff. One day a fair came to the seashore. Mr. Happy loved going to the fair. He liked the roller coaster best. Can you guess what Mr. Bump liked best? Mr. Happy asked Mr. Quiet to go on the roller coaster with him. But Mr. Quiet said it was too noisy, and Mr. Greedy was too busy eating cotton candy and taffy apples and ice cream. "I'll go," said Mr. Rush. "I like the roller coaster because it goes so fast." After his ride on the roller coaster, Mr. Happy felt rather dizzy. "Let's find something that goes a bit more slowly," he said to Mr. Rush. But Mr. Rush did not like slow things, and he rushed off to the giant slide. Mr. Happy went over to the merry-go-round. Mr. Slow had just paid for his fourth ride. He liked merry-go-rounds. Mr. Muddle was on the merry-go-round too. He was sitting on a horse backwards. The next day Mr. Happy and his friends went on a bus trip. They were going to visit an old town near the seashore. Mr. Chatterbox was sitting beside Mr. Happy. "I hope we can look at the shops," said Mr. Chatterbox, "because I want to buy some sweets and a new pair of shoes and a book to read on the way home, and—" Suddenly Mr. Chatterbox stopped chattering. He was talking to himself. The bus was empty. Everybody had gone to see the town. There was an old castle in the town. It was so old that some of its walls had fallen down. "I wonder if we will see a ghost," said Mr. Happy. Mr. Jelly trembled. Suddenly they heard a noise. Ooh! It was coming from behind the wall. "It's a ghost!" cried Mr. Jelly. But it was only Mr. Mischief. He had been playing a trick on them. On the last day of their vacation, Mr. Happy and his friends took a boat trip. Mr. Happy went to board the boat. The other Mr. Men were already there. "Welcome aboard," said the captain. "I hope the sea's not too rough today," said Mr. Happy. But the sea was calm all day, and Mr. Happy and his friends had a lovely time. The next day it was time to leave for home. They had all enjoyed themselves, even Mr. Grumpy. Questions to talk about. Question 1. Why was Mr. Grumpy bad-tempered? Question 2. Mr. Muddle put everything away in the wrong place. Did you find his socks? Question 3. Do you know what a moat is? Question 4. Why did Mr. Bounce slip off the rock? Question 5. What was Mr. Greedy eating at the fair? Question 6. Who was listening to Mr. Chatterbox? Question 7. Do you know the names of all the Mr. Men on the boat? Thank you for listening.